I decided to spend the night at my friend Daniel's house after his mother's funeral. He was devastated, and I thought it wouldn't be right to leave him alone in that huge house, which now felt emptier than ever. Alice, his mother, had been a strong presence, and the silence left behind was almost tangible. The night fell heavily, and after a few words exchanged, Daniel went to his room, and I stayed in the old guest room, a space that seemed unused for years. The clock struck 2 a.m. when I woke up to a sound coming from the hallway. It was as if someone was walking slowly but heavily, dragging their feet across the wooden floor. My heart began to race. I thought Daniel might be restless, but when I called out to him, there was no response, only the persistent sound, step by step. I got up and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. At the end of it, I saw a faint light coming from the living room, where the funeral had been held earlier. The candles we had extinguished were lit again. When I reached the living room, something felt wrong. The air was cold and carried a strong scent of old flowers. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, near Alice's portrait, there was a shadow. It was the silhouette of a woman with her hair tied back, just like Alice used to wear it. "Daniel?" I called out, my voice trembling, but the figure slowly turned its head toward me, and for a moment, I saw its face. It was her. It was Alice. I ran back to the guest room and locked the door. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. But the worst was yet to come. A faint scratching sound started at the door. It wasn't the sound of human nails. It was more like claws. And then the voice came, low and dragged out. "You shouldn't have stayed here." The noise grew louder, as if something was trying to break in. I called Daniel, but he didn't answer. Gathering my courage, I opened the door, only to find the hallway empty again. I went to his room, but he wasn't there. The bed was made, untouched, as if he had never laid down. But in the mirror of the room, there was something written with a finger on condensation that shouldn't have been there. She was never buried. In the background, I heard Alice's voice again. "Why didn't you leave?" This time, it felt like she was inside the room. I turned, but there was nothing, until the light went out. What happened after that, I can barely remember. I woke up at dawn on the living room floor, alone. Daniel was never found. And when I spoke to the neighbors, I learned something even more terrifying. Alice's body was never in that house. She had been buried days earlier in another state. I know you're here to listen to a scary story before bed, so before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel. What I'm about to tell you happened when my sister was in the hospital, and to this day, whenever I think about it, I feel a chill down my spine. My sister had been hospitalized for a few days. Nothing serious, but she needed observation. Not wanting her to be alone, I decided to stay the night at the hospital, sitting in the armchair beside her bed. The room was 317, at the end of a nearly empty corridor. There was something strange about that floor, something you could feel before you could even explain it. That night, my sister was sleeping deeply, thanks to the medication. The hospital was completely silent, except for the occasional footsteps of nurses and the distant beeping of monitors. It was almost 3 a.m. when I noticed something was off. It was a sound that caught my attention. Footsteps. They were coming from the hallway, but they were different. Slow, dragging footsteps, as if someone was struggling to walk. I peeked through the slightly open door but saw no one. I thought it might be a nurse, but the steps continued, pacing back and forth, never getting closer or farther. Suddenly, the corridor light started flickering, and a shadow quickly passed by the door. It didn't look human. It was tall, thin, and moved in an impossible way. My heart raced, but I stayed still, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I turned back to my sister. She was still asleep, but something felt wrong. Her heart monitor showed a normal rhythm, but the beeping sounded muffled, as if something was blocking the sound. Then I heard it. A voice, whispered, coming from the corner of the room. You should leave. I froze. I looked toward the sound, but no one was there. Only the chair in the corner, which now seemed slightly out of place. Suddenly, my sister opened her eyes, but she didn't look like herself. Her eyes were unfocused, as if she was seeing something beyond the room. She's here, my sister said in a voice that wasn't hers. A tear rolled down her face as she stared fixedly at the ceiling. That's when I felt an intense cold in the room. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw the same shadow standing at the foot of the bed. Its eyes were empty, but I could feel it staring at me. I screamed for help, but when the nurses arrived, everything seemed normal. My sister was asleep, the monitor was working perfectly, and the room looked as it always did. But I knew what I had seen. The next morning, a nurse asked me if everything was okay. When I mentioned the footsteps in the hallway, she hesitated before answering. No one else should have been on that floor. Room 317 belonged to our last patient. She passed away weeks ago. I've never been able to step into a hospital without remembering that night. If you ever stay overnight in a hospital, be careful in the empty hallways and watch the shadows you might see out of the corner of your eye. Now, try to sleep if you can. I know you like to hear scary stories before bed, so make sure to subscribe to the channel and get ready. What I'm about to tell you happened a few years ago, and I still get chills just thinking about it. My neighbor had a dog named Max, a huge and intimidating German shepherd, but incredibly smart. Everyone in the neighborhood said Max was special, like he could see things we couldn't. My neighbor always laughed it off, but I knew there was something different about that animal. It all started on a stormy night. I was home alone when I heard Max barking nonstop in the backyard next door. It wasn't his usual bark, it was urgent, almost desperate. I went to the window to check and saw Max standing still, staring at a spot on the fence that divided our backyards. He wasn't moving, just growling low and steady. I tried to ignore it, but the barking got louder, almost frantic. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like something was wrong. That's when I heard footsteps in my backyard. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the back door, trying to convince myself it was just a cat or some stray animal. But when I opened the door, there was nothing, just darkness and rain hitting the ground hard. I went back inside, but Max started barking again, more aggressively this time, as if he was protecting something. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to look out the living room window, which faced the backyard. That's when I saw it. There was a figure standing near the fence. It was tall, thin, and there was something off about its posture. It didn't look human. It had its back to me, but I could feel it knew I was watching. Max was on the other side of the fence, growling and lunging, but the figure didn't move. My breathing became heavy, and the air felt unnaturally cold for a summer night. I grabbed my phone to call my neighbor, but before I could dial, Max leapt at the fence, and the figure disappeared. It didn't walk or run, it simply vanished. I thought it was over, but then I heard something inside my house. A low sound, like nails scratching on the wooden floor. I turned slowly, and there was Max, standing in my living room, his fur bristling and teeth bared. But he wasn't looking at me. He was staring down the hallway that led to my bedroom. I had no idea how Max got into my house, but at that moment, it felt like the least of my problems. I looked down the hallway and saw a shadow moving slowly, as if daring me to follow it. Max started barking and ran down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. I heard a growl, followed by a sound that resembled a muffled scream. When I ran to see what it was, I found Max standing in the middle of the hallway, staring at my bedroom door, which was now slightly open. The hallway light flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw something inside the room. It wasn't human. It was large, with glowing eyes and a mouth twisted into a wrong, horrifying grin. The door slammed shut, with a force that echoed through the house, and Max began scratching at it desperately. The next morning, I told my neighbor everything. He went pale and revealed something he'd never shared before. Max has done this before. Whenever he acts like that, it means something is nearby, something that doesn't belong to this world. Since that day, I've never stayed home alone at night. And Max, he never barked at the fence again, but he still avoids looking at my backyard. If you have a dog and he starts acting strange, maybe it's seeing something you can't. And trust me, sometimes it's better not to know what's out there. Now, try to sleep if you can. I know you're here to listen to a story before bed, but before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel. What I'm about to tell you is real and still sends chills down my spine. It happened in my grandmother's house, and that night, I learned some family stories are better left untold. My grandmother lived in an old house, filled with heavy wooden furniture, creaky doors, and walls that seemed to whisper at night. She always said the room next to hers belonged to my great grandmother, who had passed away decades ago. Nobody ever used that room, out of respect. That night, my grandmother asked me to stay over to help her if needed. I thought it would be a quiet night. After dinner, she went to bed, and I stayed in the living room reading. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were light but steady, coming from my great-grandmother's room. Thinking it was my grandmother, I went to check on her. "Are you okay, Grandma?" I asked. She opened her eyes and said something that made my blood run cold. "Don't go into your great-grandmother's room. She doesn't like visitors." I laughed nervously, thinking it was just an old superstition. But the footsteps continued, now accompanied by a dry, scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across the floor. Finally, I decided to check. When I opened the door to the room, a strong smell hit me, something like very old flowers mixed with mold. The dim light from the hallway illuminated part of the room, and that's when I saw her. A woman was sitting on the bed, her back to me. She wore an old dress, her hair tied up, and her shoulders moved slowly as if she were breathing. "Grandma," I whispered, barely able to speak. She didn't respond. I took a step back, and the woman began to turn her head, very slowly. Before I could see her face, the door slammed shut, with a force so strong it nearly knocked me over. I ran back to my grandmother's room. She was sitting up in bed, staring at me with wide eyes. "I told you not to look." "She didn't want you to see her," she said, her voice trembling. I asked her who that woman was. My grandmother lowered her gaze and said, "My mother. She never left, and she doesn't like visitors." Suddenly, we heard the door to my great-grandmother's room creak open. Steady footsteps echoed in the hallway. My grandmother grabbed my arm, her grip stronger than I thought possible. The door to her room, locked just moments before, began to open on its own. Then, she appeared. The same woman. This time, I could see her face. Her eyes were empty, hollow, and her skin looked like wax. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I froze, unable to breathe. The next morning, I woke up alone in the living room. My grandmother was nowhere to be found. When I asked the neighbors about her, they said nobody had lived in that house for years. To this day, I still hear her footsteps at night, always coming closer. If you ever visit an old house, remember, some rooms are better left unopened. Now, close your eyes, if you can. I know you're here to hear a scary story before bed. So, before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let me tell you about a night I'll never forget. It all started on a regular night. I woke up thirsty, and the house was completely silent. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something isn't right. I got out of bed and went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. The hallway was dark, and the lights in the living room flickered faintly, like there was a wiring issue. That had happened before, so I didn't think much of it. When I got to the kitchen, something felt off. The window was open, and a cold breeze was coming through, but I was certain I had closed it before going to bed. I sighed, thinking maybe I had forgotten, and walked to the sink. As I drank the water, I felt it. I don't know how to describe it. It was as if someone was watching me. I looked toward the window. but all I could see was the darkness outside. Still, the air felt heavy, and the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. That's when I heard it, a faint creak coming from the living room. I put the glass down and walked toward it, thinking it might just be the wind. But when I entered, I saw something that made my heart race. In the corner of the room, near the window, there was a shadow. It didn't have an exact human shape. It was tall, disproportionate, and seemed to move, even though everything else was still. I tried to turn on the light, but the switch didn't work. The shadow grew sharper with every passing second, and then I heard it. A low voice, almost a whisper. You shouldn't be here. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't run. The shadow started to move toward me, slow and menacing. When I finally managed to move, I bolted back to my room and locked the door. The silence returned, but now it was oppressive. I thought I was safe until I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the other side of the door. Something, or someone, was there. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of my room with the lights on, holding my phone, too scared to call for help. When the sun finally came up, I worked up the courage to open the door. There was no one there, but what I found in the kitchen made my stomach drop. On the window, written with what looked like a finger on the condensation, was a message. I'll come back another night. If you ever wake up in the middle of the night to grab a glass of water, remember to close your windows and never stare too long into the dark corners of the house. Now, try to sleep if you can. I know you like to hear scary stories before bed, so make sure to subscribe to the channel and get ready. What I'm about to tell you happened a few years ago, and I still get chills just thinking about it. My neighbor had a dog named Max, a huge and intimidating German shepherd, but incredibly smart. Everyone in the neighborhood said Max was special, like he could see things we couldn't. My neighbor always laughed it off, but I knew there was something different about that animal. It all started on a stormy night. I was home alone when I heard Max barking nonstop in the backyard next door. It wasn't his usual bark, it was urgent, almost desperate. I went to the window to check and saw Max standing still, staring at a spot on the fence that divided our backyards. He wasn't moving, just growling low and steady. I tried to ignore it, but the barking got louder, almost frantic. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like something was wrong. That's when I heard footsteps in my backyard. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the back door, trying to convince myself it was just a cat or some stray animal. But when I opened the door, there was nothing, just darkness and rain hitting the ground hard. I went back inside, but Max started barking again, more aggressively this time, as if he was protecting something. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to look out the living room window, which faced the backyard. That's when I saw it. There was a figure standing near the fence. It was tall, thin, and there was something off about its posture. It didn't look human. It had its back to me, but I could feel it knew I was watching. Max was on the other side of the fence, growling and lunging, but the figure didn't move. My breathing became heavy, and the air felt unnaturally cold for a summer night. I grabbed my phone to call my neighbor, but before I could dial, Max leapt at the fence, and the figure disappeared. It didn't walk or run, it simply vanished. I thought it was over, but then I heard something inside my house. A low sound, like nails scratching on the wooden floor. I turned slowly, and there was Max, standing in my living room, his fur bristling and teeth bared. But he wasn't looking at me. He was staring down the hallway that led to my bedroom. I had no idea how Max got into my house, but at that moment, it felt like the least of my problems. I looked down the hallway and saw a shadow moving slowly, as if daring me to follow it. Max started barking and ran down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. I heard a growl, followed by a sound that resembled a muffled scream. When I ran to see what it was, I found Max standing in the middle of the hallway, staring at my bedroom door, which was now slightly open. The hallway light flickered, and for a brief moment I saw something inside the room. It wasn't human, it was large, with glowing eyes and a mouth twisted into a wrong, horrifying grin. The door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the house, and Max began scratching at it desperately. The next morning, I told my neighbor everything. He went pale and revealed something he'd never shared before. Max has done this before. Whenever he acts like that, it means something is nearby, something that doesn't belong to this world. Since that day, I've never stayed home alone at night. And Max, he never barked at the fence again, but he still avoids looking at my backyard. If you have a dog and he starts acting strange, maybe it's seeing something you can't. And trust me, sometimes it's better not to know what's out there. Now, try to sleep if you can. I know you're here to listen to a scary story before bed, but before we begin, hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to tell you is something I've never been able to forget. And maybe you won't either. It all happened a few years ago during summer vacation. I went to visit my Aunt Helena, who lived on a farm surrounded by a massive cornfield. It was one of those places that felt like it was straight out of a movie, with silence broken only by the wind rustling through the cornstalks. But there was something about that farm no one talked about. Something about the scarecrow. My aunt said the scarecrow had been there for decades. It protects the cornfield, she'd say, always with a serious expression. But the way she looked at that field gave me chills. There was something in her tone that felt more like a warning than an explanation. On the first night, after a quiet dinner, I went to bed. The guest room where I stayed was at the back of the house, with a window that overlooked the cornfield. Under the moonlight, I could see the scarecrow standing in the middle of the field, its arms outstretched and wearing a tattered straw hat. Something about it felt wrong, but I tried to ignore it. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't footsteps, but something dragging along the ground, as if someone was shuffling through the cornfield. I looked out the window, but the field was dark and the scarecrow was still there, standing motionless. I thought about going back to sleep, but the sound grew louder, and then I noticed something terrifying. The scarecrow wasn't where it had been before, it had moved. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the scarecrow was closer now, almost halfway between the center of the field and the house. That was impossible. Scarecrows don't move, not on their own. I tried to wake my aunt, but she wasn't in her room. The front door of the house was unlocked, swaying in the wind, and there were footprints in the dirt leading straight into the cornfield. I grabbed the flashlight and followed the tracks, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Pause. Sound of rustling leaves and slow footsteps. The further I walked into the cornfield, the more the air seemed to change. There was a strong smell of rot, like something decaying, and then I heard it. A low, raspy laugh coming from somewhere ahead. When the flashlight beam finally landed on the scarecrow, it was standing still again, but now it was facing away from me. This isn't real, I whispered to myself, but then it turned its head, slowly and deliberately. The scarecrow's eyes weren't fake, they were alive. They glowed with a malicious light, as if it knew exactly what I was thinking. "Why are you here?" a raspy voice said, seeming to echo from all directions. I started to run, pushing the cornstalks aside with my hands, trying to find my way back to the house. But the sounds followed me, footsteps, laughter, and something dragging behind me. When I finally reached the house and slammed the door shut, I locked everything and collapsed onto the floor, trying to catch my breath. The next morning I went looking for my aunt, but she was nowhere to be found. The cornfield was eerily quiet, and the scarecrow, it was back in its original place, standing in the center of the field, as if nothing had happened. But something about it was different. Its clothes were stained with blood, and the hat, it was my aunt's. I never went back to that farm, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of the cornfield and the low laughter of the scarecrow. If you ever visit a place like that, remember, not all scarecrows are made of straw. Now close your eyes, if you dare. The strange neighbor in the apartment next door. When I moved into that building downtown, everything seemed normal. It was a small, cheap place, perfect for starting a new life. Most of the neighbors were friendly, except for the one living in the apartment next door. He never left, but sometimes I could hear him. Low sounds, almost whispers, in the dead of night. At first I thought he was just reserved or eccentric, but things started to get strange. One night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, dragging, as if someone was carrying something heavy. The sound stopped at my neighbor's door, and soon after, I heard a click, like someone unlocking it. I was curious, but I chose not to get involved. That night, however, I heard something different coming from the wall that separated our apartments. It was a muffled sound, like crying, but distorted, as if it were coming from an old tape recording. The next day, I asked the building superintendent about my neighbor. He gave me a strange look. "There's no one living there," he said. "The apartment's been empty since the last tenant disappeared 2 years ago." Those words sent chills down my spine. I went home convinced the superintendent was wrong. Maybe the neighbor was discreet, and the superintendent didn't even know he was there. I decided to pay closer attention. That night, I lay down with the lights off, waiting to hear something. Around 3 in the morning, the sound started again. First, footsteps in the hallway. Then, the sound of the door unlocking. My heart raced as I slowly got up and walked to the door to look through the peephole. There was no one there. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but then I heard something from the wall. It sounded like scratching, like long nails scraping against wood. I took a deep breath and knocked on the wall. The sound stopped. "Is someone there?" I whispered. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. Then, a voice answered, low and hoarse. "Can you hear me?" My eyes widened. It was impossible. The apartment was empty. I ran to the living room and stared at the wall. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I'm here," the voice replied, closer now, as if right on the other side of the wall. I decided to do something I shouldn't have. I took the spare key the superintendent had given me and went to the apartment next door. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door. When I stepped inside, the air was heavy, filled with a musty smell and something else, metallic. The place was completely empty. No furniture, no curtains, nothing. Just the sound of rain hitting the window. I was about to leave when I noticed marks on the floor, deep scratches leading to a door at the back of the apartment. I walked toward it, feeling my heart pound in my chest. I turned the doorknob, and the door creaked open. Inside, there was a staircase leading down into darkness. Against all better judgment, I went down the steps. The smell grew stronger, and I began to hear something. It was the same distorted crying, but this time clearer, more real. When I reached the bottom, the dim flicker of a single light bulb revealed something I will never forget. The floor was covered in photos, all of me. Photos taken from different angles. Me entering my apartment, sleeping in my bed, even looking out my window. In the center of the room, there was a chair, and sitting in it was the neighbor. He was thin, pale, with hollow eyes, and a smile that didn't look human. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, his grin stretching wider as I struggled to find my voice. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer. He tilted his head, as if analyzing my question. Then calmly he replied, "I live with you." Without thinking, I ran back up the stairs, sprinting down the hallway as fast as I could. When I reached my apartment and locked the door, I called the police. They arrived within minutes, but when they searched the apartment next door, they found nothing. No photos, no man. Just an empty, dusty room. Now every time it rains at night, I hear footsteps, scratching, and that same distorted crying coming from the wall. Sometimes I feel like something is in my room, watching me. When I turn off the light, I see a shadow that shouldn't be there, always in the corner with a smile that never disappears. And you, what would you do in a situation like this? Leave a comment below and subscribe for more stories told in the rain.